In August 2012, the hand of the Chief Medical Examiner of Los Angeles County, Dr. Lakshmanan Satyavagiswanan, forever changed the history of American cinema with one slow movement of a ballpoint pen. On the table lay an official document, the death certificate of actress Natalie Wood. In the cause of death column, accidental drowning was neatly and dryly crossed out. Over the old typewritten line, a new formulation was written in ink: drowning and other undetermined factors. An additional report from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department impassively recorded fresh bruises on the arms, an extensive bruise on the right knee, and a scratch on the neck. The body was found in the icy ocean 1 mile south of the isthmus on Santa Catalina Island. The deceased wore only a flannel nightgown, a down jacket, and socks. No signs of struggle on the deck of the pristine yacht Splendor. Only the dark water. Natalie Wood was an A-list superstar, holder of 3 Oscar nominations, an icon whose facade seemed carved from marble. But behind the polished wood of the saloon and the smiles at social receptions hid an exhausting mechanism of monstrous family gravity. The fates of those who remained on the shore after that night shattered into disproportionate fragments. One person retained absolute control over a multi-million-dollar fortune and continued to shine on television, becoming an untouchable Hollywood patriarch. Another woman, who had given decades to blind adoration and complex rivalry, ended her days in a cheap motel in the city of Thousand Oaks, fleeing medical bills for her daughter's treatment and humiliating homelessness. Others publicly renounced blood ties, choosing unwavering loyalty to the one whom the police would later name a person of interest in the investigation. The environment in which such tragedies form rarely arises in a single day. The girl's mother, Maria Zakharenko, built her empire on fragile children's shoulders. She brought Natalia, and later the younger Svetlana, into a world where love was measured by studio contracts. It was the mother who instilled in her eldest daughter a pathological, paralyzing fear of dark water. Family lore held that a street fortune teller had predicted the girl's death by water. This fear became the basal foundation of Natalie's psyche. She was afraid to swim and panicked if water got into her eyes in the bath. The paradox of this story strikes with its illogic. A woman who recoiled at the sight of the night ocean allegedly decided, on the night of November 29, 1981, to go down to the water alone in stormy weather to secure the valiant inflatable boat banging against the side. A person does not walk toward their deepest phobia, instilled since childhood, in the middle of the night, wearing only socks. Unless behind them, on the deck of their own yacht, there is something more frightening than the icy abyss. In 1956, the monumental film The Searchers was released. 10-year-old Svetlana, who had taken the harmonious pseudonym Lana Wood, played the younger version of her 18-year-old sister Natalie's character. The on-screen illusion became a merciless prophecy, a verdict issued decades ahead. Lana was fated to forever play the younger version, to finish abandoned lines, to pick up the scraps of parental attention. Lana did not merely grow in the shadow of a superstar. She herself was that shadow, woven from the same genetic threads, but deprived of the main spotlight beam. We all fear failing to meet our parents' expectations, fear being worse than those we genuinely love. For Lana, this fear was not a philosophical abstraction. It was her daily routine. Love for her sister blended with a quiet, corrosive rivalry. This was not simple envy. It was the tragedy of a person who, from birth, was handed someone else's script, but forgotten to be written into the lead role. The greenhouse of maternal ambitions was designed for only one exotic flower. The second was meant to serve merely as foliage, accentuating the brightness of the first. In such a greenhouse, the plants intertwine their roots so tightly that pulling out one inevitably damages the other. And when the main plant suddenly vanishes into the ocean, the second remains alone with the scorched earth, trying to prove to the world that it, too, had the right to a voice, to the truth, and to its own legacy. In 1971, the screens of world cinemas erupted with the brilliance of the blockbuster Diamonds Are Forever. 25-year-old Lana Wood stood before the cameras side by side with Sean Connery. Her character, Plenty O'Toole, became an integral part of global pop culture. This was not a pathetic existence in low-budget films, as lazy chroniclers later liked to claim. It was a deafening triumph, the pinnacle of Hollywood Olympus, a costly ticket into the most exclusive club of superstars. Dozens of actresses would have given literally everything for just one such scene in a Bond film. But Lana's tragedy lay in the merciless optics of her fate. No matter how high she climbed the career ladder, she always had to look upward, because there, at an even more unreachable height, shone Natalie. Holder of Oscar nominations, muse to the era's finest directors, wife to influential television magnate Robert Wagner. Their sisterly relationship never fit into the primitive template of burning envy or villainous rivalry. In her future memoirs, Lana would write about deep attachment, periods of painful estrangement, and inevitable attempts to mend what was broken. It was a classic drama of symbiotic dependence. Natalie was the unconditional center of gravity. Lana, the satellite doomed to orbit along a prescribed path. When the older sister shone, the younger felt pride densely mixed with quiet melancholy. When the older stumbled, the younger rushed to help. People tend to demonize those in secondary roles, attributing to them treachery or mediocrity. Yet the truth is that living in the shadow of another's greatness is exhausting. Daily labor that demands an enormous reserve of humility. Lana was neither a saintly victim nor a mercenary schemer. She was a woman who tried with all her might to build her own house from the bricks left over after constructing a palace for her sister. On the windy evening of November 28, 1981, this radiant palace began to collapse rapidly. The restaurant, Doug's Harbor Reef on Santa Catalina Island, hummed with the voices of patrons. At one of the tables sat 4 people: 43-year-old Natalie Wood, her 51-year-old husband, Robert Wagner, 38-year-old actor Christopher Walken, Natalie's co-star in the new science fiction film, and the captain of the yacht Splendor, Dennis Deverne. From the outside, they seemed the absolute embodiment of the American dream, lifted from glossy magazine pages. Success, wealth, effortless smiles, the clink of glasses filled with expensive alcohol. But an invisible, yet physically tangible tension had already spread through the air. The wine consumed erased social filters, slowly exposing the hidden, deep cracks in the polished facade of the Wagner-Wood marriage. Around 10:30 in the evening, the party left the restaurant and returned aboard the pristine yacht. What happened over the next several hours became the subject of the most heated debates in Hollywood's criminal history, but the documented facts paint a picture far removed from romantic melancholy. Police reports impassively record the time. Between 5 minutes past 11 and 11:30 at night, a furious, loud quarrel erupted aboard the Splendor. In the confined space of the saloon, where every spoken word struck the wooden panels and returned multiplied by the echo, ambitions, jealousy, and panic collided. Walken, Wagner, and Wood, 3 people accustomed to commanding the undivided attention of millions of viewers, found themselves locked in the cage of their own uncontrollable emotions, in the middle of the dark ocean. Robert Wagner, in a fit of rage, smashes a bottle of wine. This is not a fabrication of the tabloid press. It is a documented fact that he himself later acknowledges in his memoirs when describing that night. The marriage of Natalie and Robert was a legend rewritten twice. They married in their early youth, then divorced, went through other marriages, and again united their fates before the altar. For the press of the early 80s, they represented the perfect narrative of a second chance, of a love capable of overcoming time. But in 1981, the dynamics of their power changed drastically. Wagner was enjoying the colossal success of the detective series Heart to Heart. He was at the very peak of television fame. Natalie, however, was going through the most difficult transitional period. The great roles of her youth were behind her. The industry mercilessly demanded new faces. Christopher Walken represented an entirely different pole. Young, unconventional, recently having won an Oscar, he embodied the new, free wave of cinema. The conflict aboard the Splendor was not a banal scene of jealousy. It was a collision of tectonic plates. Natalie's need for creative freedom clashed with Wagner's desperate desire to maintain absolute control over his life. After the broken bottle, silence falls. A heavy, damp silence of the night at the isthmus. Natalie disappears forever from the men's field of vision. Robert Wagner reports over the ship's radio about the disappearance of his wife and the small inflatable boat Valiant only at 1:30 in the morning. Almost 2 hours pass between the moment when the actress's voice was last heard in the cabin and the moment when the airwaves are torn by a call for help. 2 hours is a true eternity when it concerns a person who panics at the sight of dark water, finding herself at night on a slippery deck during an approaching storm. The ocean forgives no smallest mistakes, but it is also an ideal repository, washing away traces and leaving investigators with only fragments of phrases from people whose memory is distorted by shock. And somewhere on the mainland at that moment, Lana was sleeping, not yet knowing that the morning news would cleave her biography into before and after, transforming her from the sister of a superstar into a professional seeker of answers, doomed to a 40-year struggle with the closed doors of Hollywood mansions. The morning of November 29, 1981, began with a chilling discovery. At 7:44 a.m., a body was found in the water off the coast of Santa Catalina Island near Bluebird Canyon. Natalie Wood, the great actress whose face looked out from thousands of billboards, now floated lifelessly on the waves, clad only in a nightgown, a jacket, and thin socks. The official machinery of justice worked quickly and impassively. The Los Angeles police conducted a formal investigation, and soon the world heard a brief, unchallengeable verdict. Accidental drowning. Tragic absurdity. A cruel joke of fate upon a person who had fled from water all her life. The case was closed, the documents filed in the archive, and Hollywood's elite put on black suits to escort their star on her final journey. Robert Wagner remained in the foreground. The loss of his wife seemed only to enhance his aura of a noble patriarch. He continued to appear in Heart to Heart, received multi-million-dollar contracts, and his face never left the television screens. Moreover, according to Natalie Wood's will, it was Wagner and the daughters who became the main beneficiaries of the enormous estate. The document was drawn up so that Lana Wood, the younger sister, blood relative, received not a cent. This legal fact is recorded in court documents and became the point of no return, after which the relatives' paths began to diverge rapidly. Natalie provided for her husband and children, which was an absolutely logical step. But the complete absence of the sister in the will laid a delayed action mine under the relationship between Lana and Wagner. The financial chasm between them began inexorably to widen, turning into an existential abyss. In 1984, Lana released a book, Natalie, a memoir by her sister. This was the first public stone cast into the smooth surface of the official version. Lana did not put forward direct legal accusations. She had neither evidence nor resources for that. But she began asking questions. Frightening, uncomfortable questions that destroyed the tidy narrative of an accident. She recalled Natalie's pathological phobia, the fact that her sister would never have gone down to the water alone at night, the fact that the bruises described by the pathologists in passing required closer attention. The book became a bestseller, but the establishment received it coolly. To many influential figures in Hollywood, Lana looked like a failure trying to monetize grief and earn crumbs from her famous brother-in-law's name. Her voice drowned in the chorus of sympathy for the noble widower. Decades passed, and the contrast in their lives grew ever more glaring, unbearable to an outside observer. Wagner aged comfortably in luxury, surrounded by the love of Natalie's daughters, Natasha and Courtney. He raised Natasha as his own, becoming for her an absolute authority and an unquestioned father figure. The girls grew up firmly convinced that the tragedy of 1981 was a pure accident, an injustice of the universe, and that their stepfather was an innocent victim of circumstances. For them, Robert was a pillar of normality in the mad world of the film industry. They saw his care, his warmth, his readiness to protect the family. In this reality, there was no place for Lana. She became for them a toxic element, a source of unnecessary pain, a ghost of the past who stubbornly refused to disappear. The absurdity of the situation reached its peak in the spring of 2017. Journalists from the program Inside Edition published documentary footage that shocked America. 71 years old. An age when people usually dote on grandchildren in a rocking chair, reaping the fruits of the years lived. But Lana Wood, the former Bond girl, sister of the Hollywood legend, was not in a cozy home on the coast. Together with her daughter Evan, son-in-law, and 3 grandchildren, she was huddled in a cramped room of a cheap motel in the town of Thousand Oaks. Homelessness. Not metaphorical, but the most real, brutal kind, with cardboard boxes and the daily fear of eviction. The cause was unbearable medical bills. Evan was fighting severe Hodgkin's disease. The rent on the house was overdue, and the family found themselves on the street. This visual contrast strikes harder than any drama. On one side, yachts, multi-million-dollar trust funds, the respect of colleagues, and the comfortable old age of Robert Wagner. On the other side, a cramped motel room where an elderly woman collects donations through the GoFundMe platform. Friends managed to raise about $40,000 to save the family from hunger. And it was from this cramped room, amid scattered belongings and her daughter's medicines, that Lana continued stubbornly demanding the truth. Her voice, hoarse from fatigue, began to sound even louder. Lana's revolt was not simply a desire to take revenge on a wealthy relative. It was an existential cry from a person whom the system had spat out onto the roadside, while those who, in her opinion, were hiding the truth continued to drink champagne on the Hollywood Hills. She became the archetype of a broken but unbroken rebel. Society often demands ideal behavior from victims. We want the sufferer to be meek, noble, their motives crystal clear. But Lana was a living, complex woman, crushed by debts, exhausted by her child's illness, and torn by a decade-long grudge against the man who had deprived her of her sister, and then of her inheritance. Her accusations against Wagner grew sharper. She no longer chose her words carefully. She demanded the reopening of the case, appealing to conscience, to logic, to Natalie's memory. And the most surprising thing was that her stubbornness, her marginal status, and her desperate situation suddenly forced the system to listen. What began as a whisper in 1984 threatened to turn into a destructive hurricane capable of tearing down the facade of the perfect Hollywood family. Back in November 2011, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department did what Lana had believed in for decades, but what the establishment refused to believe. The investigation was officially reopened. The impetus was not the sisters' pleas, but new documented testimony from the man who had been on the yacht on that fateful night. Captain Dennis DeVerne, who had long kept silent, finally spoke. In his book, Goodbye Natalie, Goodbye Splendor, written in collaboration with Marty Rooley, he described in detail the furious quarrel between the spouses on the stern of the yacht that preceded the actress's disappearance. The captain's testimony was not an emotional outburst. It became the procedural basis, the foundation for a new investigation. The system that had protected its own for decades cracked under the pressure of a witness who could no longer, or would not, carry the weight of the secret. DeVerne claimed that the conflict did not end with the broken bottle in the saloon. He told investigators about the tense atmosphere on the rear deck, that Wagner allegedly delayed the search by forbidding the searchlights to be turned on and refusing to contact the Coast Guard immediately after Natalie's absence was discovered. These statements completely changed the optics of what had occurred. From a tragic accident, from an absurd confluence of circumstances, the picture transformed into something far more sinister, into deliberate inaction, into an attempt to conceal the scale of the catastrophe until it was too late. The Los Angeles police did not rush to conclusions, but the wheels of the bureaucratic machine had already begun turning in the opposite direction. August 2012 became the turning point. The chief medical examiner of Los Angeles County changed the cause of death on Natalie Wood's certificate from accident to undetermined factors. This was not merely the rewriting of a document. It was a legal acknowledgement that the original investigation had been blind, or had deliberately turned a blind eye to obvious evidence. The additional pathologist's report drew particular attention to the bruises on the actress's body. The nature of these injuries, fresh bruises on the arms, an extensive hematoma on the right knee, an abrasion on the neck, indicated that they could have appeared before Natalie entered the water. These were not marks from striking rocks or the side of the yacht during a fall. The examination acknowledged a high probability that these injuries had been sustained as a result of a physical confrontation. For Lana, this decision became a bitter triumph. Everything she had insisted on for years, while being treated as an outcast, a mad relative trying to destroy someone else's peace, was now confirmed. Her position was no longer a conspiracy theory. It had taken on the substance of forensic evidence. But this triumph brought her neither peace nor reconciliation with the family. On the contrary, the fault line grew even deeper. Natalie's daughters, Natasha Gregson Wagner and Courtney Wagner, categorically refused to accept the new findings of the investigation. For them, it was tantamount to betraying the man who had raised and loved them. In their eyes, Lana became absolute evil, a woman who had methodically, over the years, destroyed the memory of her mother, dragging the family name into the mire of police investigations and tabloid headlines. In February 2018, Lieutenant John Corina, representing the Sheriff's Department, made an official statement. Robert Wagner was henceforth considered a person of interest in the investigation into Natalie Wood's death. The police stated that he was the last person to see the actress alive, and that his version of events had changed repeatedly over the years. This was not a murder charge, but in the legal context, it was a colossal shift. A man who for decades had enjoyed the status of the impeccable widower was now officially at the center of a criminal investigation. Wagner, for his part, through his attorneys, categorically rejected all suspicions, refusing further conversations with investigators on the grounds that he had already told everything in 1981. The conflict between the two camps took on the character of a total, exhausting war of attrition, in which the weapons became public statements and books. Lana, living in a motel and fighting for her daughter's life, represented the camp of uncompromising truth, demanding answers at any cost. Natasha Gregson Wagner represented the camp defending the family, upholding the inviolability of memory and the right to quiet mourning. In this confrontation, there were no right and wrong in a simple, everyday sense. Both women were victims of the same tragedy, but they chose completely different survival strategies. Lana chose rebellion and the destruction of illusions, even if it cost her the remnants of her reputation and her connection with her nieces. Natasha chose to preserve stability and loyalty to her stepfather, refusing to believe that the man who read her bedtime stories could have been involved in her mother's death. The Wood family tragedy demonstrates a universal human fear, the fear of destroying basic trust. When the foundation on which your life is built begins to crumble, people react differently. Someone, like Lana, picks up a sledgehammer and begins smashing the remaining walls to reach the foundation and find the truth there, however terrifying. Someone, like Natasha, seals the windows shut and pretends that the cracks are simply a decorative element. Both strategies are dictated by pain, and both carry destructive consequences. Police reports, altered death certificates, new witness statements. All of these are merely dry facts falling into the bottomless well of family trauma, where the echo of past grievances drowns out the voice of reason. In 2020, the pendulum of public opinion swung in the opposite direction when a documentary film from a prestigious network titled Natalie Wood, What Remains Behind, premiered. The producer of this film was Natasha Gregson Wagner, the actress's eldest daughter. This was a carefully calibrated, emotionally charged cinematic response to all the accusations leveled against her stepfather over nearly 40 years. The film became not merely a tribute to the memory of a great actress. It turned into a manifesto of defense. Viewers saw an entirely different Robert Wagner, not a cold manipulator concealing a dark secret, as the tabloids had tried to portray him, but an aging, vulnerable man who, with tenderness and pain, recalled his wife while sitting face to face with his stepdaughter in the rays of the soft California sun. There was no place in this picture for police reports on bruises or the testimony of Captain Davern. It was the territory of private, deeply intimate grief, where access by outside investigators was categorically forbidden, and love was placed above any legal doubts. The psychology behind Natasha's choice requires deep respect and understanding free of superficial judgment. At the time of her mother's death, she was only 11 years old. On that cold November night, her familiar, safe world collapsed, and the only person who managed to hold the fragments of that world together was Robert Wagner. Historical facts irrefutably show that he did not turn away from someone else's child. He raised Natasha as his own daughter, providing her with stability, a brilliant education, and unconditional paternal love during the most vulnerable period of her life. Wagner became the unshakable shield that protected the girls from the merciless flashes of paparazzi cameras and the cruel, speculative newspaper headlines. To demand cold objectivity from Natasha toward the man who literally saved her psyche in early childhood is to completely misunderstand the basic mechanisms of human attachment. For her, accepting the police version or believing Lana's harsh accusations would have meant voluntarily killing her father and destroying the foundation of her own personality. Her defense of Wagner is not blindness. It is a conscious act of loyalty to the man who was there when everyone else merely stood aside and watched the unfolding family catastrophe. The documentary also raised another crucial philosophical problem that often escapes notice: the right to legacy. Natasha publicly and quite convincingly accused the press, the creators of popular crime podcasts, and Lana herself of reducing the colossal, brilliant life of Natalie Wood to the level of cheap tabloid fare. 3 Oscar nominations, innovative roles, the most difficult work on herself, sincere charity, and boundless maternal love. All of this was mercilessly erased from the public consciousness, replaced by a single macabre image of a woman in a flannel nightgown floating in the icy water of the isthmus. Natasha fought to restore her mother's dignity so that she would be remembered as a great creator rather than an eternal victim of an unsolved crime. In this aspiration lies a vast, bright side of the Wagner family. Their desperate attempt to preserve normality and respect for high art under conditions of constant, maddening external pressure. However, on November 9, 2021, this fragile world, built with such effort, was once again subjected to a crushing blow. Lana Wood released her second, much harsher book, Little Sister: My Investigation into the Mysterious Death of Natalie Wood. If in 1984 she had only timidly asked questions, now, decades later, standing on the threshold of her 75th birthday, she had moved to direct, uncompromising statements. On the pages of her book, Lana openly declared that it was Robert Wagner who bore direct responsibility for Natalie's death. She described in detail her numerous meetings with investigators from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, her exhausting attempts to obtain the truth, and her endless pain from the complete, final rupture of relations with her nieces. The book became the final chord in her years-long campaign, the furious cry of a woman who had nothing left to lose, neither status in Hollywood circles, nor financial well-being, nor her last family illusions. Against the backdrop of this titanic, destructive battle between 2 strong women, ruthlessly defending their versions of the truth, the fate of the younger daughter, Courtney Wagner, remained in the shadows. Her life illustrates with crystalline clarity the archetype of a person who could not withstand the colossal, granite weight of family grief. Unlike her older sister, Courtney did not become a public defender of the family, did not give loud interviews, and did not make documentaries glorifying her stepfather. Dry police and medical chronicles impassively record her arrests for possession of controlled substances and her long, exhausting struggle with severe addiction to powerful medications. Courtney's tragedy is a quiet, almost invisible testimony to how public trauma slowly eats away at a person from within. While Lana and Natasha waged fierce media wars for Natalie's historical legacy, Courtney was simply trying to survive each new day, carrying within her the genetic memory of her mother and living under the constant, suffocating pressure of public attention that expected from her either great achievements or a public downfall. The fate of Courtney Wagner is a tragic counterpoint, a quiet requiem against the deafening roar of mutual accusations. She became neither a rebel destroying the system, like Lana, nor a pragmatic architect of a new facade, like Natasha. She became a victim of slow, silent decay. In this story, there are no unambiguous villains whose actions can be explained by primitive greed or cruelty, and there are no perfect victims. Each participant in the drama was maimed by circumstances that proved stronger than they were. Courtney's addiction is not a manifestation of weak character. It is a medical fact, a documented result of attempts to drown out the unbearable pain of losing her mother when you are a child, and the whole world around you is debating who is to blame for her death. Her silence, her absence from the public sphere, speaks of the scale of the tragedy far more than any loud press releases or scandalous memoirs. Society often forgets those who simply do not find the strength within themselves to participate in global battles for the truth, preferring to save themselves in illusions or chemical oblivion. As we peer into this complex kaleidoscope of destinies, it becomes obvious that in the history of the Wood-Wagner family, there is no saving miracle of normality in its usual sense. No one slipped away into a quiet, measured life, becoming a lawyer or a teacher, as sometimes happens in such sagas. Their entire life, every decision and every conflict of theirs was inextricably bound to that icy November ocean. Even the rare moments of relative calm and visible well-being that occurred in their biographies always carried the aftertaste of hidden threat, the expectation of a new blow. That very paradox of normality in this case lies in the fact that for this family, the state of normality became an eternal, exhausting struggle. For Robert Wagner, normality became holding the defense for decades, refusing to communicate with the press on certain topics, and surrounding himself with loyal people. For Lana, normality became living with a sense of global injustice, turning her life into an endless crusade against her all-powerful brother-in-law. For the daughters, normality became the necessity of constantly protecting their parents' memory from any encroachments from outside. The entire situation crystallizes the deepest philosophical question about the limits of human capabilities in confronting fate. What happens to people when they find themselves locked in the cage of one single night, 40 years long? The police reports of the sheriff's department, the altered death certificates, the new witness statements, these are merely formal attributes, scenery, against which the real inner tragedy unfolds. The true drama lies in the inability to let go of the past. Each side clings tightly to its version of the truth, because abandoning it means the collapse of the entire constructed coordinate system. If Natasha believes Lana, she loses the father who was her main support. If Lana retreats, she admits that 40 years of her life were spent in vain, and the memory of her sister betrayed. They are both hostages to a situation in which there is no winning option, only endless circling, where each new turn brings only new suffering. Even Natalie Wood's own death in this context ceases to be merely a legal fact or a criminal mystery. It becomes a powerful metaphor for how fear materializes in reality. A woman who spent her entire life fleeing the fortune-teller's prediction, who panicked at the thought of dark water, ultimately finds her end in it. This is not mysticism, not a cheap esoteric trick to attract attention. It is a cruel statement of fact. We often attract precisely what we fear most, unable to break the vicious circle of our own phobias and obsessions. Natalie's fear of water was known to all her loved ones. It is a documented fact of her biography, confirmed by numerous interviews. And it is this fear that makes the circumstances of that night so absurd and frightening at the same time. To force a person suffering from such a phobia onto a slippery deck at night could only be a reason surpassing in strength this deep, primal terror. That is why the case of Natalie Wood remains open, and Robert Wagner continues to be listed as a person of interest. Not because the police have found irrefutable evidence of murder. There is no such evidence, and no charges have ever been filed. The case remains open because it contains too many gaping voids, too many contradictions that cannot be dismissed as simple accident. These voids are filled with speculation, theories, and mutual accusations, creating a toxic atmosphere that poisons the lives of several generations. The story of Lana Wood, who found herself on the brink of survival in a cheap motel, is not merely a social drama about the cruelty of the capitalist system. It is the direct consequence of that same night when the invisible thread connecting the sisters was severed, and everyone was left to fend for themselves in a merciless world where truth always has its price, and justice often proves an inaccessible luxury. The archive of the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner's Department is a sterile space where human tragedies are compressed into orderly filing folders. That very document, altered in August 2012 by Dr. Lakshmanan Satyavagiswaran, continues to lie there, physically embodying the central, insoluble dilemma of this story. The crossed-out line about accidental drowning and the words written in ink about undetermined factors did not bring Natalie Wood back to life. They brought no catharsis to Lana Wood, did not compel Robert Wagner to break his vow of silence, and did not shake Natasha Gregson Wagner's faith in her stepfather's integrity. This piece of paper became merely a bureaucratic monument to a destroyed family, an official confirmation that the system had capitulated before the density of their secrets. Bureaucracy recorded the existence of a mystery, but proved utterly powerless to solve it. In July 2017, just a few months after America saw Lana Wood in a report from the cheap motel in Thousand Oaks, the dry medical bulletins recorded a new death. Evan Malcolm, Lana's only daughter, for whose medical treatment the family had ended up on the street, died of heart failure due to complications from Hodgkin's lymphoma. Lana had fought against the powerful Hollywood system, demanded the reopening of the investigation into her sister's death, and appeared on television shows. But she proved completely powerless against inexorable biology. She lost not only her famous sister, but also her own child. Her life turned into an endless succession of losses, in which the sole unchanging anchor remained the demand for truth about the events of November 29, 1981. In this fanatical search for answers lies a monstrous irony. In attempting to uncover the mystery of another's death, Lana spent the remainder of her own life on it, allowing Natalie's shadow to forever consume her own identity. On the other side of the barricades, in the private mansions of California, Robert Wagner has crossed the threshold of 90 years. The man who in 1981 stood atop the television Olympus now keeps silent, unreachable to reporters and detectives from the sheriff's department. His legacy is forever split in two. To some, he is the devoted patriarch who raised another man's children and saved them from public orphanhood. To others, he is a cold-blooded manipulator who managed to outplay justice and carry the terrible solution to the mystery of the night at the Isthmus to his grave. In this duality, no compromise can be found. Natasha Gregson Wagner continues to defend him with the fury of someone for whom an admission of her stepfather's guilt would be tantamount to the destruction of her own personality. Her documentary, her interviews, her book, these are not merely a PR campaign. They are an instinct for self-preservation, proving that the human psyche can erect impenetrable walls of denial when behind them lies salvation from absolute madness. The story of the Wood-Wagner family mercilessly destroys our illusions that love is always a creative force. In this tragedy, love became the principal destructive element. Maria Zakharenko's maternal ambitions tore the girls from poverty, but created a greenhouse in which survival depended on status. Lana's sisterly attachment compelled her to demand justice, yet that same attachment deprived her of her financial inheritance and destroyed her ties with her nieces. Wagner's paternal love for Natasha protected her in childhood, but laid the foundation for endless public conflict in the future. The daughter's devotion preserved the family's reputation, but eliminated any doubts, making them accomplices in concealment or victims of blind faith. Every manifestation of love in this story led to new traumas. Every noble intention turned into catastrophic consequences for the other side. Natalie Wood remained a prisoner of her chief fear, instilled in childhood. The dark water of the Isthmus did not merely take the life of the holder of 3 Oscar nominations. This water became a metaphor for unspoken grievances, hidden conflicts, and the monstrous pressure under which these people lived. The ocean proved an ideal keeper. It washed away the physical evidence from the deck of the yacht Splendor, but left on the shore people doomed to endlessly replay that fateful night in their memories, books, and statements. The true tragedy lies not in the fact that we do not know for certain how exactly the actress ended up in the water. The real horror lies in the fact that none of the possible answers can heal those who remained alive. The truth that Lana Wood so desperately demanded from her motel room has no healing power. If Robert Wagner is indeed guilty of deliberate inaction or physical violence, it will destroy Natasha and Courtney's world, turning their lives into a lie. If it truly was a chain of tragic, absurd accidents, then decades of Lana's struggle will prove a meaningless crusade that destroyed her own destiny for the sake of a ghost. This is the merciless optics of human grief. Sometimes the absence of an answer is the only thing that prevents the fragile structure from final collapse. Locked in different worlds, in luxurious estates and cramped rented rooms, the protagonists of this drama continue their silent dialogue, gazing at the same ocean. The icy wind off the shores of Santa Catalina Island blows today exactly as it did in November 1981. The water indifferently beats against the rocks of Bluebird Canyon. In this story, there will be no final rap of the judge's gavel. There will be no scene of reconciliation with tears of remorse. There is only the paper form of the death certificate, rewritten in ink. There is an elderly actor silently looking out the window. There is the younger sister who has lost everything except her stubborn memory. And there is the silence of the radio waves on the Coast Guard frequency, torn by a brief message about a missing person at 1:30 in the morning. A signal that still echoes over the Hollywood Hills, reminding us that even the brightest stars go out when they collide with the cold, impenetrable abyss of human nature.